Hi, scientists. In this second task-specific clarification, we're going to take a look at what's required when inquiring and designing. This will be our grades for thinking, and we'll use that part of the rubric as a guide. Again, we're going to look at our simulation, the lab guide, and the rubric. In terms of the instructions are really at this point up to you. You're going to identify a research question and then plan your investigation. As we think about designing our lab, our investigation, and first starting off by stating a research question, you want to be able to state exactly what it is you're trying to find out. The reader should be able to imagine and understand your experiment after reading this. It should explicitly include your independent and dependent variables and any background information that helps us to explain the problem. Let's take a look at the rubric. The rubric says to explain a problem or question. At the highest level, explain is different than describe, and that's different again than outline, and that's different again than simply stating. In other words, it's not enough to just ask the question. You need to build out the context for what it is you're hoping to investigate. And then that will lead you to developing your hypothesis. Your hypothesis is effectively a predicted answer to your research question. You're going to describe how you think the experiment will actually turn out when you do that manipulation of your independent variable. And you want to explain why you think this is going to happen, and this is where the scientific reasoning really needs to come into play. Again, if we take a look at the rubric, we're looking at formulating and explaining, different than up here, simply formulating or simply outlining. If we're formulating and explaining a testable hypothesis, we're going to use PEAL. And as we use PEAL, P-E-E-L, our P is going to tell us the prediction, and then we're going to explain why we think it's going to happen. In order to explain that, we're going to use evidence to support each claim that we make. The evidence can come from the findings that you've had in your tutorial for this simulation, theory that we explored in class, or new research that you can conduct online or in your textbook. This is also an important place to make use of the scientific vocabulary that is found both in the lab instructions and that we've explored in class that you can find in the unit outline for systems. Then we're going to take a look at the variables. 3 sections here as you consider the variables. We need to identify what is the independent variable and how are we manipulating it and how are we measuring it. We're also going to identify the dependent variable. Again, how are we measuring it? And then we're going to identify all the things that need to be controlled, every single factor that could have an influence on your dependent variable, but isn't the factor that you're interested in, and so must be kept exactly the same every time you do the investigation. When we did the previous design lab, there was some confusion between the independent variable and the controls. Make sure that you don't include your independent variable as one of the controls because it's actually a different thing. So we continue to take a look at the variables in the rubric. We are again explaining how to manipulate. We're not just listing, we're not just saying that it's important to control. You must also identify how, in the simulation, settings are positioned in order to make it so that somebody can read your lab report and do exactly the same thing that you did. We also need to know how you're going to collect sufficient relevant data. How much data do you think is sufficient? Does the simulation put any limits on this? Does the simulation have anything that is takes away from the real world experience? keep note of that, and you can talk about that later in the end of your lab report too. You also want to design a logical, complete method and discuss every single piece of the equipment in terms of how you're working with the simulation. So the simulation is not real, so don't describe it in terms of it being real. It is a simulation, but you do need to describe how to manipulate the aspects on screen. So if you are manipulating the reproduction rates, you can describe how to manipulate the slider as an example. Again, somebody reading your report should be able to replicate exactly, with no questions, exactly what you did when you provided yourself with the method and followed it to create the data that you're going to later describe in your report. In this particular investigation, we don't have safety considerations because it is a simulation. That piece of it has been removed. Materials we already discussed. Procedure we already discussed. In the next screencast, we will take a look at data collection and processing. For now, please take a look at how you think you're going to create your research question, hypothesis, and then describing your variables and method.